Welcome to the city, where men swore the river itself was alive, where the Volga whispered through frozen fog and soldiers claimed they saw leeches longer than rifles moving beneath the ice. It's not a myth from the trenches of madness. It's a report, logged, dated, signed. 1942. Stalingrad. The winter the world cracked open. The air was so cold it sliced through lungs like razors. Shells didn't echo anymore. They froze mid-scream against walls of ice. And in that silence, in that pulse between death and delirium, something stirred. Not gunfire, not engines. A ripple. A sound, wet, deliberate, and too heavy for fish. They called it the feeding. Before we begin, leave a comment where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening. Tell me if you'd been there knee-deep in frozen water, would you have believed it? Or would you have said what every commander said in his final report? The men are hallucinating. Because what if they weren't? What if this war birthed something nature itself hadn't prepared for? December 1942. Stalingrad snow so thick it swallows footsteps, artillery buried under frost, and men turning to stone where they fell. The 62nd Army huddles in what's left of a grain elevator. Across the Volga, the Wehrmacht digs in, praying for supplies that never come. The smell of iron diesel and rot clings to the fog. Rivers of smoke, rivers of blood, and beneath them all the real river black, slow breathing. One night a Soviet patrol disappears. No shots, no screams, just gone. The next morning a shape surfaces near the pier. They think it's driftwood, but when it rolls, the men see skin. Smooth, dark, and pulsing like muscle without bone. A jawline forming where no creature should have one. They shoot, and the water boils red. The sergeant writes in his log, it didn't die. It sank. That entry still exists in a folder sealed until 1973. Classified biological anomaly, Volga sector. The handwriting shakes halfway through the word leech. The soldiers start whispering. They say the Volga eats. That it remembers the blood spilled into it. That every corpse dumped into the current feeds something older, something the bombs woke up. They laugh about it at first. Then one night, a German scout boat doesn't return. Then another. Then three. And by the end of the week, both sides stop sending boats across the river altogether. The front lines freeze in place, not by orders, but by fear. Some said it was radiation. Some said it was a trick of hunger. Others, those who survived, said they saw it. A head rising through mist veins, glowing faintly green eyes that reflected the fire of the burning city. They swore its skin rippled like canvas stretched over breathing steel. They swore it wasn't one of them anymore, wasn't anything. There's a report from the German 6th Army Medical Corps, filed February 1943. Subjects recovered from the river show tissue loss, consistent with suction wounds, diameter exceeding 30 centimeters. Depth undetermined. It was stamped invalid, then buried under casualty logs. Because who in Berlin would believe that something in the Volga was feeding on soldiers? But listen. Stalingrad was already a place where reality bent. Rats ate the dead. The dead froze standing. Whole platoons vanished under collapsing snow, and in the quiet between artillery barrages you could hear the city breathing. A slow, wet, rhythmic sound that no one could locate. Engineers blamed the pipes. Priests blamed sin. The rest just stopped asking. A Soviet lieutenant named Anton Baranov wrote home, "If we don't die from bullets, the river will take us. It moves at night. It knows our names." The letter was never sent. It was found decades later, folded into a pocket fused with ice. Before the historians call this madness, remember this: madness requires imagination, and these men had none left. They'd seen too much, every horror war could offer, and yet this was different. Something primal. Something that made them forget the enemy across the river and fear what was between. Stalingrad, 1942. 1 million men trapped in a dying city. Shells howling through glass bones. The Volga frozen thick as armor, hiding something that breathes. Welcome to the place where even death wasn't the worst thing waiting for you. This is not about legends. It's about what the records missed: the sightings, the disappearances, the whispers written in pencil and erased by command. This is where war met biology and biology looked back. Before we go further, pause. Think of that moment. A river turned graveyard. A city turned stomach. A war so violent it awakened something that shouldn't exist. Comment below. What do you think really happened under the ice of Stalingrad? Were they hallucinating? Or did the river evolve? Because tonight, you'll hear the evidence. You'll read the reports. You'll meet the men who survived and the ones who vanished into the water. This is 1942. Stalingrad soldiers spoke of leeches the size of men. February 1942. The Volga lay under a sheet of black ice, cracked and veined like old glass. The sound of artillery rolled endlessly across the steppe, a metallic thunder that seemed to circle back on itself. The city of Stalingrad had stopped being a city, it was a skeleton. What once were factories and tram lines were now open ribs, frostbitten and bent toward the sky. Inside those bones, both armies clung to life like parasites feeding off the same corpse. Every wall carried the echo of boots, every basement smelled of kerosene and meat that wasn't quite fresh. Smoke coiled upward but never dispersed. It froze midair, lingering in a gray haze that erased horizon and memory alike. In that endless dusk, the men of both sides fought not for victory, but for the right to keep breathing another hour. The Soviets called it the City of Steel, but there was no steel left, only frozen mud, black snow, and the red sludge that pooled after every exchange of mortars. The Germans called it Die Hölle am Fluss, hell on the river, and that name, whispered through frost-bitten lips, clung to every trench and tunnel. They said the river was cursed. They said even the birds refused to fly over it. And yet every day, convoys tried. Every night, boats crossed under sniper fire carrying bread, morphine, or the dying. Most made it halfway. Some made it back. Others never seen again. By then, command had issued orders forbidding mention of river anomalies. The reports had become too frequent. Patrols vanished. Divers found shredded harness straps, helmets bent in half. The explanation was always the same: enemy sabotage, thin ice panic. But no one truly believed that. A war fought with iron and fire does not erase men without sound. Something else was moving. The fear was a contagion spreading faster than frostbite. At night, under the moonlight, the Volga gleamed dull silver. The surface seemed still, but soldiers claimed it shifted when you weren't looking, like breath under a blanket. Some said they saw shadows beneath the ice, long, slow, fluid shapes that didn't match the current. It swims against the flow, one radio operator wrote in his log before his post was found empty. They dragged the river with hooks for 3 days. All they pulled up was a single boot, the leather inside sucked clean as if by pressure. The human mind, under starvation and shock, breaks easily. But this was different. The Red Army's psychological units noted a pattern. The sightings increased during nights of heavy bombardment, when shrapnel rained into the river, as if the sound woke something, as if explosions called it closer. By late December, even the officers began to notice. Major Karpov, commanding the 272nd Infantry, wrote in his diary, "The river moves when we fire. It responds." His entry ends mid-sentence. Across the river, the Wehrmacht had their own stories. A prisoner captured weeks later told Soviet interrogators about a squad that had tried to cut ice blocks for drinking water. When one man swung his pick, the ice bled. The red didn't spread, it rose boiling upward. "The ice is meat," the prisoner said. They laughed, then noted his eyes. The iris had burst from frost. The body was found dead the next morning. Official cause: exposure. Unofficial note: body desiccated, not frozen. In the chaos of Stalingrad, madness was easy to dismiss. But this wasn't hallucination. Documents from the Soviet 10th Sanitary Battalion list 47 cases of rapid dehydration syndrome bodies, reduced to brittle skin within hours of death, blood volume untraceable. Medical officers couldn't explain it. One autopsy recorded tissue compression rings around the torso, symmetrical, circular. The entry was redacted, days later replaced with cause frost trauma. But the handwriting under the correction still showed through, as if drained. Life on the front had narrowed to instinct. Hunger, cold, fear. Men stopped speaking of the enemy, they spoke of the river. They stopped crossing it. The supply barges were rerouted, but even avoiding it wasn't enough. The river crept closer every night, flooding trenches, filling tunnels, soaking sandbags in icy seepage. Soldiers began hearing noises in the pipes. Suction sounds, slow and rhythmic, like breathing through a throat. One engineer swore the sound grew louder when he turned off the generator. Meanwhile, the Volga was changing shape. The thickest sections of ice began to bulge upward, as if something underneath was pressing against it. The bulges cracked with hollow thuds that echoed across the city, indistinguishable from distant artillery. Commanders blamed temperature shifts, but the bulges moved. It wasn't until January that the pattern became undeniable. Patrols stationed near the grain terminal sector Delta 4 reported vibrations in the ice strong enough to rattle equipment. They described them as pulses. Every night between 0200 and 0300, the same vibration would travel east to west, lasting 7 minutes, stopping precisely near the central docks. A German listening post recorded it, thinking it might be coded artillery signals. When analyzed later, the pattern matched the rhythm of a living heart. The legend grew teeth. The men called it Volchskaya Piavka, the Volga Leech. The name spread faster than bullets. They drew it on trench walls, a black coil with rows of eyes. They whispered it in ration lines. The Germans had their own term, der Sauger, the sucker. It wasn't superstition anymore. It was a language of survival. You could talk about the leech, or you could talk about death. But they were starting to mean the same thing. Scientists tried to intervene. A group of biologists from Kuibyshev was flown in under secrecy to study the biological activity in the river. They drilled holes through the ice and dropped sensors. The instruments came up coated in mucus-like residue. Chemical analysis hemoglobin traces human origin. The lead scientist Dr. Petrov insisted the samples indicated a parasitic organism of unknown classification. He was told to destroy his findings. 2 days later, his tent was found empty, zipper torn from inside. His assistant swore she heard something drag across the ice that night, slow, heavy, and wet. Still, the war continued. Bombs didn't stop for monsters. February brought more snow, more hunger, and the slow collapse of the Sixth Army. But even as human resistance broke, the rumors persisted. When the spring thaw began, the ice turned red before it melted. The color spread in rings, as if the river itself was exhaling. No one dared to fish. No one dared to touch it. The officers ordered the soldiers to boil the water, but even boiled it smelled like iron and rot. And yet, through all this horror, what frightened them most wasn't the unknown. It was the silence that followed. After every bombardment, the world would hold its breath. The gunfire stopped. The wind froze. The river went still. Then came the sound. A deep, distant suction like an enormous breath drawn through the lungs of the earth. Men froze, eyes wide, rifles shaking. They knew it was listening. At dawn, fog rolled thick across the Volga. German snipers saw shapes beneath it, lines, curves like enormous tendrils curling under the surface. They reported it to command, but their radio cut out. When they tried again, only static. The next day, those same snipers were gone, rifles still leaning against sandbags. War has always hidden its own nightmares behind official language, casualties, attrition, logistics. But some horrors refuse translation. The survivors who lived to tell said it plainly. The river was hungry. By March, Stalingrad had become a frozen grave. The buildings bled rust. The rats had vanished. Even the birds had stopped circling. And yet the soldiers stayed clinging to what little warmth was left. They prayed. They cursed. They told stories to keep their minds from splintering. Stories about the thing in the river. About how it moved when you looked away. About how it was born from all the blood the war had spilled. There are records hidden deep in archives of those final weeks. A German radio log reads, "Movement under ice resembling multiple human silhouettes." A Soviet note answers, "Not men, the river." What happened next is still debated, whether mass hysteria or something more. But for those who were there, no explanation mattered. They had seen the water breathe. They had seen shapes rise and vanish beneath their boots. And by the time the thaw came, they understood one thing: Stalingrad would never give its dead back. The Volga kept them. The siege would soon end, but the stories would not. In the silence after victory, survivors carried the memory like frostbite, numb on the surface, dead underneath. And in their nightmares, the river still pulsed, still fed, still waited. Official reports began surfacing in February 1943, signed and sealed under the heading, "Anomalous Losses Volga Sector." They were terse, stripped of emotion, reduced to lists and numbers. But between those lines, the horror bled through. One report stated 32 men missing, presumed drowned. River conditions abnormal. Another, remains recovered without skeletal structure intact. In bureaucratic ink, the impossible had become an equation. The Volga had started taking lives faster than artillery. Command ordered a scientific investigation, not to find truth, but to restore control. Numbers charts logic. These were the new weapons against madness. The Office of Military Hygiene dispatched a small team of biologists and engineers under Captain Sergei Kurov. Their task measure oxygen content, current velocity, and thermal gradients beneath the ice. They drilled 12 holes across a 1-kilometer stretch near the central docks. Every time they dropped sensors, they vanished. No snap, no crack, just sudden absence. The cables were pulled up, clean ends fused smooth as glass. Kurov wrote in his notes, "The water behaves as if under pressure, as if something seals the opening the moment we look away." He added a single line beneath it. "Recommend immediate evacuation of all units within 200 meters of riverbank." That recommendation was ignored. Meanwhile, both armies were collapsing from exhaustion. Ammunition ran dry, food became a myth, and frostbite ate through fingers faster than bullets. In that desolation, numbers became truth. Between November 1942 and February 1943, 1.1 million Soviet soldiers were engaged in the battle. Over 850,000 were wounded or killed. The German Sixth Army, originally 300,000 strong, was reduced to fewer than 91,000 survivors by the time surrender was declared. Those are the official counts. But unofficially, thousands more simply vanished. Not buried, not burned, not frozen. Gone. The absence grew larger than any map could hold. The data pointed nowhere and everywhere at once. Engineers recorded pressure waves moving upstream against the current, impossible by hydrodynamic law. The amplitude matched seismic activity, but there were no quakes. Instruments placed near the banks picked up rhythmic pulses at intervals of 40 to 50 seconds lasting for hours. One technician trained in physiology recognized the pattern. "It resembles cardiac rhythm," he whispered, "only scaled to something enormous." The Office of Naval Intelligence later compared those readings with sonar experiments conducted decades later. The patterns matched the biological signal of giant cephalopods, except this was freshwater thousands of kilometers from any sea. No species could exist here, they concluded. And yet, the readings persisted. In January, the Soviets launched Operation Ring, closing the final encirclement of the German Sixth Army. Artillery thundered across the city, fire lighting the ice like veins of molten metal. Every explosion threw debris into the Volga, feeding it with oil, blood, and steel. Witnesses from both sides described the same phenomenon, the river breathing. The ice expanded upward in convex ripples that traveled in waves from shore to shore. It moved like a diaphragm under pressure. "It's the river," one officer said, exhaling. When the 64th Army advanced, they found trenches flooded not by thaw, but by something darker. The water was warm steam rising from its surface despite the 20-degree air. It smelled of copper and decay. When a medic dipped his glove, it came out slick with mucus, red and viscous. Samples were taken, sealed in glass. 2 days later, the glass burst from internal pressure. The substance inside continued to move, but the most chilling records weren't in reports, they were in diaries. One German Feldwebel wrote, "At night we hear the river whispering beneath us. The ice is transparent when the moon is full. I saw eyes below, dozens of them, watching." Another entry from a Soviet private. "The river knocks when it wants company. 3 times before dawn. Always 3. Fact gave way to folklore, but the line between them was thinner than a sheet of ice." Scientists sent telegrams describing biological displacement, a polite term for something moving where life shouldn't. The 10th Medical Command noted a series of cases labeled Syndrome Volga 42, soldiers found alive but unconscious skin, pale gray pupils dilated. They were breathing but pulse undetectable. Within minutes, their veins turned black. Dissection revealed blood completely absent, their organs desiccated yet unbroken. No sign of violence, no exit wound, no frostbite, as if drained from within. In a last attempt to understand, Kurov's team lowered a camera rig beneath the ice. The footage lasted 11 seconds before static overtook the reel. When developed, the final frame showed something, a curve of flesh covered in concentric rings like suction scars. Within one of those rings, a reflection. A face, human mouth open, eyes glassy. It wasn't screaming, it was inside. The footage was sealed. Only 2 men saw it before the reel disappeared. One later shot himself. The other refused to sleep near running water ever again. To anchor the nightmare in reason, Moscow ordered silence. The term Volgeskaya Piyavka was banned. Official communiques described all related deaths as exposure-related. The reports were filed away under psychological contamination. Yet rumors persisted in whispers passed between exhausted soldiers like matches in a dark room. They believed the river was punishment, that the Volga was reclaiming what man had spilled, that every bomb, every drop of blood, every scream had awakened something that had slept since the Ice Age. Historians decades later discovered a chilling overlap. In 1926, an expedition of Soviet hydrologists had drilled deep cores from the Volga Delta. Their notes described unidentified organic matter found sealed within prehistoric ice, dense, fibrous, elastic. The entry ended abruptly, specimen reactive to warmth. No further studies followed. No one connected it until the war. Stalingrad's siege turned every law of nature inside out. Physics broke biology, rewrote itself, and time itself froze in that ruin. The river became more than a boundary. It was a mouth, an organism, a witness. The war fed it endlessly. The numbers continued to grow. Between December and February, the Sixth Army reported an additional 9,400 unexplained absences. Soviet counterintelligence estimated over 11,000. That's nearly 20,000 men erased. No bones, no remains, no answers. The official Soviet compilation. Documents of the Stalingrad Front Vol. 3 includes a redacted appendix titled Phenomena of the Volga Basin. Only one line remains legible. The enemy was not alone. By March, when the thaw began, those few who survived said the river changed color. Not blue, not gray, rust red. The ice cracked open like an old wound. In the meltwater floated fragments of helmets, rifles, and something else, translucent tubular strands that twitched when touched. Soldiers burned them, but they didn't burn. They shriveled, releasing a smell like ammonia and blood. The ashes glowed faintly in the dark. When questioned, survivors repeated one phrase: "The river remembers." They meant it literally. That every drop of blood poured into its veins had taught it something new. That it had learned hunger, and hunger never forgets. The post-war commissions dismissed all of it. They labeled the data war psychosis under extreme duress. But there was one exception, a secret memorandum by Colonel Ilyin recovered years later from the archives of the Ministry of Defense. It reads, "Leeches are hermaphroditic. They can reproduce without pairs. What if one grew large enough, fed long enough to spawn again?" His note was dated April 2nd, 1943. Underneath a single word, observed, the final fact entered into record that spring was geological, not biological. Riverbed seismic scans revealed a cavity 40 meters wide, 200 deep, directly beneath the area where most disappearances occurred. The structure was irregular, funnel-shaped, with walls lined in concentric ridges. Geologists argued it was erosion, but others quietly called it a nest. Those numbers, those logs, those sealed pages, they remain in archives under thick dust. But even now, when divers descend into the Volga during maintenance work, their instruments fail exactly at that same coordinate. The pressure rises. The current still pulls down instead of across. The facts are there, immutable, cold as the river itself. The legend grew from them like frost on glass. And through the mixture of truth and fear, one thing became undeniable. Whatever haunted the soldiers of Stalingrad was not imagination. It was memory recorded in the earth, written in water, measured in missing men. ChatGPT said, "Night fell on Stalingrad like a lid closing over a jar. The bombardment had ceased not because mercy had arrived, but because there was nothing left to destroy. The ruins glowed dimly under the aurora of fires that never died. And somewhere in that silence, two men waited for dawn. Sergeant Anton Baranov and Private Yuri Melnik, neither heroes, neither cowards, just remnants. They sat in the shell of a workshop, the floor slick with oil and melted snow rifles leaning against the wall like useless relics. The wind moved through broken windows, carrying a sound that wasn't quite wind, something heavier, slow or wet. Anton stared at the darkness beyond the door. "You hear it again," he whispered. Yuri didn't answer. His hands shook as he held a can of condensed milk, precious stolen. He'd been saving it for a week. He didn't open it. "It's under the floor," Anton said. "It's closer tonight." The boards trembled beneath them, a pulse steady as breath. "It's the pipes," Yuri muttered. But there were no pipes left. Outside, the river was shifting. The ice gleamed like tarnished metal, fractured into long veins of silver and black. The moon hung low, casting reflections that seemed to move against the current. Yuri couldn't stop watching it. He'd seen things before, dead men walking rats frozen mid-stride, but this was different. The river looked alive. He swore he saw the ice bulge rising in slow waves like something turning beneath a sheet. 3 men went to fetch crates this morning, Anton said, voice flat. No one saw them again. He didn't need to add where they'd gone. The riverbank was only 30 meters away. Command says it's thin ice, Yuri said. Command says many things. Anton's smile was a split in the frost. Command doesn't listen when the river breathes. They both turned as the sound came again, a long, low suction rising from below. The floor vibrated, dust dancing in the air. For a moment, it felt as if the ground itself had lungs. The milk can fell from Yuri's hand, rolling across the floor. It stopped near a drain hole and vanished. Not fell, not dropped. Vanished as though the hole had swallowed it. Silence followed, heavier than the air itself. Anton stood slowly, rifle ready. The boards were damp now, slick and dark. Move, he whispered. They stepped into the open air, the cold burning their throats. The fog from the Volga rolled toward them like smoke from an unseen fire. Shapes moved within it, not men, not anything that walked. They reached the edge of the river. The ice stretched out, cracked and gleaming under the half-light. The fog thinned for a moment, revealing what looked like ropes embedded in the surface. Only they weren't ropes. They pulsed, flexed, twitched. Anton took a step back. Jesus, Yuri breathed. No, Anton said. Something older. A sudden jolt underfoot. The ice groaned, then split with a sound like bone snapping. Steam poured from the fissure, stinking of blood and ammonia. Through it, something massive shifted. A circular mouth opened beneath the crack rings of teeth glistening like blades, the inner layers moving independently, grinding. The sound was not a roar, but a suction, a vacuum so deep it pulled air itself downward. They fired reflex, not reason. Bullets sparked off the ice, useless. The shape beneath it recoiled, the surface rippling outward. For a moment the ice went still. Then the fissure widened. A column of water erupted upward, black and red and thick as tar. It hit Yuri first. He screamed once, a short, wet sound, then was gone, pulled down so fast his shadow barely moved. Anton stumbled backward, slipping on the slick ground. The column collapsed, dragging everything toward the center, the suction relentless. He crawled, clawing at the frozen soil, eyes wide. Behind him the river opened wider, an abyss with edges lined in glistening rings. He ran. Didn't remember how far. Didn't stop until his lungs burned like fire. When he reached the ruins of a warehouse, he collapsed face down in the snow. It was warm beneath him. Too warm. He rolled over and saw the ground pulsing, frost, melting steam rising. The warmth wasn't from fire. It came from below. Anton survived that night, though no one believed what he saw. He was found the next morning by a rescue team, half-frozen eyes wide open. His report was short: the river feeds. It learns. Command filed it under trauma. But one of the rescuers wrote in his own log, "Ice still moving when we arrived. Smelled like iron. Heard breathing." For the next week, the 62nd Army avoided the riverbanks. Supply routes shifted. Yet the disappearances didn't stop, they simply moved inland. Trenches closest to the Volga began to sink overnight, collapsing into pits that filled with black slush. Soldiers reported seeing bubbles rise through the snow. One corporal claimed to see a shape slide through the mud, leaving a trail of blood behind. The phenomenon reached a crescendo during the final days of the siege. The Germans, now trapped, began surrendering in clusters, hands raised, eyes hollow. Soviet troops herded them toward the docks for transport, but the river had other plans. Witnesses described it as a convulsion. The ice heaved upward in massive waves, splitting like a giant lung inhaling. A roar of water followed, swallowing men, wood steel. Barges cracked in half. Prisoners and guards alike vanished into the chaos. Survivors said the water rose 20 meters high, then fell in silence. Later analysis suggested underground gas explosions caused the event. But the men who stood there swore otherwise. One lieutenant said he saw something beneath the waves, something coiled vast with flesh that shimmered like oil. It wasn't the river moving, he said. It was something inside it turning over. That night, as fires burned across the city, the Volga finally stilled. The breathing stopped, but the quiet didn't bring comfort. It brought dread. When morning came, a thin mist rose from the river, and with it came the bodies, hundreds of them drifting together in clusters. At first, the soldiers thought they were corpses of the drowned. But as they pulled them closer, they realized the bodies were empty, hollow skin, shriveled faces, caved inward eyes, sunken black. They floated light as paper. When cut open, they contained nothing but water. Anton Baranov saw it himself. He never spoke again. After the surrender, Soviet medical teams were ordered to collect and catalog the remains. Officially, the cause of death was listed as extreme dehydration. But the medics whispered other words: drained, sucked, fed. Samples were sent to Kuibyshev for study. The laboratory burned to the ground 2 weeks later. No cause ever confirmed. A single page survived from those tests, later recovered from archives in 1981. It reads, hemoglobin absence consistent with extracorporeal absorption. Unknown mechanism. Possible enzymatic leech analog size indeterminate. The handwriting is shaky letters slanting as if written in haste. Beneath it, destroy samples immediately. The few soldiers who lived long enough to tell the tale carried scars that never healed, not physical, but in the eyes. They would startle at the sound of water. One veteran was found years later near the Volga, standing barefoot at the bank, whispering to the current. When asked what he was doing, he said, "It listens when you speak kindly." He drowned that night. Among the locals, the legend solidified. They said the war had poisoned the river, turned it into a living thing. Mothers warned their children never to swim in spring. The Volga remembers who fed it. Fishermen spoke of nets ripped apart by unseen strength of currents that pulled boats sideways of nights when the water glowed faintly red beneath the moon. Scientists dismissed it as sediment. But the fishermen knew better. And yet, amid all this horror, the strangest thing was what came next. In the months following the thaw, the river's flow changed course slightly, by just 2 degrees, barely measurable. But in doing so, it carved out a deep trench near the very site of the greatest losses. A trench over 200 meters long and shaped like a perfect spiral. Hydrologists said it was erosion, but the divers sent to survey it refused to go beyond 50 meters. They said the light didn't work down there, that something was blocking it, swallowing it whole. No one ever dove again. The coordinates were quietly erased from maps. Years later, when the war was over and the city rebuilt, Anton Baranov's granddaughter visited that same shore. She found nothing but smooth stones and slow water. But when she leaned closer, she swore she heard it faint, rhythmic, steady, a heartbeat beneath the surface. And somewhere in that endless black current, the thing that had fed on war slept again. Or maybe it didn't sleep at all. Maybe it waited patient, ancient, remembering every sound, every scream, every drop. Because once a river learns to hunger, it never forgets. Spring 1943 came late to Stalingrad. The snow melted not into water, but into blood-colored mud, thick and clotted. The city was quiet now, quiet in a way that felt wrong. No gunfire, no engines, just the groan of buildings collapsing under their own rot. Victory banners flapped over ruins where no one was left to cheer. Yet beneath that surface triumph, an unease grew, a question no one dared ask aloud. What had really happened to the river? The Soviet command sent in reconstruction crews, engineers, sappers, hydrologists, to reclaim the Volga crossings. The ice had finally given way, but what lay beneath defied explanation. Steel girders were twisted into corkscrews, barges bent in half as though crushed by pressure from below. Divers were dispatched to clear the wreckage. The first group lasted 2 hours, the second only 20 minutes. They surfaced, shaking eyes wide, refusing to go back. When pressed, they gave no technical report. Just one sentence repeated between them. "It's breathing down there." Official records from the 1943 River Restoration Project remain partially classified, but fragments survive coded telegrams, lab memos, and handwritten notes. One message dated May 9th reads, "Found organic matter fused with metal hull, texture consistent with living tissue." Another from a week later, traces of hemoglobin in sediment levels incompatible with water contamination hypothesis. The engineers stopped sending updates after that. Their camp near the West Bank was found abandoned tents, collapsed fires still burning. Only their boots remained arranged neatly in a circle. For years, the incident was buried beneath the noise of post-war reconstruction. The city rose again, factories rebuilt, bridges redrawn. The Volga, once a symbol of horror, became a symbol of rebirth. But those who lived close to it knew better. Fishermen whispered about sudden drops in the current, as if the water lost direction. Whole schools of fish surfaced belly up, untouched by poison or heat. The nights were stillest in June when the air was warm and the fog rolled low. That's when the sound returned, a deep pulse felt more than heard, shaking windows and hearts alike. The Ministry of Natural Resources launched a quiet investigation under the guise of studying hydrothermal anomalies. The lead scientist was Dr. Alexander Verkin, a physicist known for his work on underwater acoustics. He arrived with an array of sonar instruments, expecting geological tremors or methane pockets. Instead, his devices registered rhythmic bursts at exact intervals 46 seconds apart. Too regular for tectonic activity, too biological for machinery. The frequency increased each night, building towards something like a pattern. When plotted on paper, the waveform looked disturbingly like a heartbeat. Verkin filed a report, clinical cautious. The Volga Basin exhibits periodic acoustic emissions of unknown origin. Suggest continuous monitoring. He didn't mention the rest, that the pulse seemed to answer the ship's own sonar pings, altering rhythm when probed. On the fifth night, he ordered the instruments shut down. His crew said he couldn't stand the feeling that something was listening back. Meanwhile, across the city, strange disappearances resumed. 2 workers from the new ferry terminal vanished during night shifts. Guards claimed they'd heard splashes, but saw no one in the water. A week later, a barge carrying construction materials drifted downstream, unmanned anchor chain, severed by something smooth, not cut. The hull bore circular scars, each the size of a human torso. By July, Verkin's data reached Moscow. Military scientists seized the project, classifying it under biological counterintelligence. They feared enemy experiments, German remains, chemical residue, perhaps even escaped pathogens. But none of the tests confirmed that. Radiation levels were normal. Chemical traces non-existent. What they found instead was protein. Pure, unclassified protein, thicker than blood, forming sheets across the riverbed. Under microscope, it twitched. Fact met folklore in the darkest corners of those labs. The researchers compared the samples to known species, annelids, nematodes, amphibians. Nothing matched. The tissue regenerated when sliced. It contracted when exposed to light. One scientist described it as a living net. Another whispered what everyone was thinking, but dared not say that it was still feeding. The regime refused to acknowledge anything supernatural. A new narrative was printed for internal circulation, bacterial bloom caused by industrial contamination. It became doctrine. Yet the documents betray fear between the lines. Marginal notes read sample moved overnight tubes empty by morning, avoid prolonged proximity. Then the file ends abruptly. The final annotation written in red pencil says only do not disturb. For the soldiers who returned to rebuild the silence was worse than war. One of them, Corporal Dmitry Kolesnikov, kept a small journal. His handwriting trembles across the pages. The river hums when the moon is high. We feel it in our bones. It is not sound, it is pressure. My teeth ache when it comes. Another entry. Dogs refuse to drink. They stare at the water, whining tails low. One jumped in last night. It didn't float back. Factories dumped waste into the Volga throughout the decade, trying to drown its memory in metal and fuel. But sometimes waste barrels vanished. Whole rafts of debris would sink straight down, no bubbles, no ripples. Divers later reported hollow chambers under the riverbed lined with soft walls. One wrote, "It feels like skin." He never returned. By 1948, an official sanitation barrier was established, 10 kilometers of restricted waterway near the old battlefield. Publicly, it was to prevent contamination. Privately, it was to keep anyone from getting too close. Yet even from distance, fishermen swore they saw lights flicker beneath the surface, green dim pulsing. The government suppressed all mention, but the locals preserved the story. They spoke of the mother leech born of war, nourished by blood. They said it was the Volga itself learning to live, learning to hunger. Children were told not to throw stones into the river, not to shout near its banks. It listens, the elders warned. And when it remembers, it pulls. Years passed. Stalingrad became Volgograd. The ruins turned to monuments. The world moved on. But the current beneath the surface never changed. In 1962, a new hydroelectric plant project resumed dredging in the forbidden zone. Workers unearthed what they thought was an ancient tree trunk 20 meters long, black rubbery. When cut with a saw, it bled. The foreman ordered it buried again. The section chief who logged the event died in his sleep 3 nights later, lungs filled with water. The cause, drowning on dry land. By then, the few surviving veterans were old men. Some were interviewed for documentaries, their memories polished into propaganda. Yet when the cameras stopped, their stories slipped. They spoke of comrades taken whole, of hearing voices in the river mist calling their names. One man said he saw the water rise into the shape of a soldier, his own face staring back, before collapsing into foam. He begged the crew not to film near the banks. Science tried one last time. In 1971, satellite imaging captured unusual temperature gradients along the Volga near Volgograd. One section registered consistently warmer than surrounding waters, forming a circular hotspot, 500 meters wide. Instruments detected subtle vibrations every 46 seconds, the same rhythm Virkin had logged decades before. The report never reached the press. Today, the archives remain sealed. The myth lingers. Tour guides dismiss it as superstition, a wartime ghost story. But fishermen still refuse to cast nets near the old coordinates. Divers avoid it entirely. And every few years, after heavy rains, something rises. Debris, they say. A tree trunk, a dead animal. But under flashlight, the surface looks wrong, smooth, glistening, patterned in rings. The current around it always flows inward. The facts, stripped of fear, still defy reason. Pressure waves recorded for decades. Missing personnel without trace. Unexplained biological residues. Each attempt to explain collapses into silence. The official conclusion, written by the last committee in 1983, reads, "Anomalous hydrodynamic event of indeterminate cause. No further study recommended." Yet scrawled beneath it, almost illegible, is another line, one that breaks the mask of science. It's still there. The river runs quietly now, tourists photographing its calm expanse, children tossing stones that never seem to make a splash. The monuments gleam under the sun. But at night, when fog settles low and the wind stops moving, locals say you can feel a pressure in the chest, a gentle pull, a rhythm in the earth beneath your feet. And if you stand long enough, you'll notice the ripples. Not moving outward, but inward toward the same invisible center that has never stopped feeding since 1942. Because wars end, empires fall, but hunger that never dies. Decades later, when the world had long buried the ruins of Stalingrad under marble and myth, the river still refused peace. In 1989, during the late years of the Soviet Union, a team of hydroelectric engineers began expansion work near the Volga Dam. They were not soldiers, not believers in ghosts, only men with charts and deadlines. Their machines drilled into bedrock, sending vibrations deep below the riverbed. Within 3 days, the sensors began to fail, first the pressure gauges, then the sonar, then the electrical lines themselves. The cables were pulled up, stripped insulation, melted smooth as if they'd been dragged through acid. The chief engineer wrote unknown corrosion source, odor of ammonia like decaying meat. He filed the report, then quietly requested reassignment. The official explanation blamed methane pockets. But among the divers, an old rumor resurfaced, whispers of the Volgeskaya Piyavka. One night, an electrician named Pavel volunteered to fix a submerged turbine alone. His colleagues watched his tether line descend into darkness, his headlamp a fading star under the green water. 15 minutes later, the line jerked violently. Then it went slack. When they pulled him up, only the harness came back. The buckles were intact metal, polished smooth as though something had sucked the material clean. The ministry silenced the incident within 24 hours. But word spread as it always does. The locals said the river had remembered, that the vibrations of drilling had woken what war had only lulled. "It sleeps until disturbed," said one fisherman, "and then it feeds again." That same spring, the Volga flooded. Not by storm, not by ice melt. It rose under a cloudless sky, swelling past its banks without rain. The water turned the color of rust. Fish surfaced belly up, their bodies marked with circular scars. Newspapers reported it as chemical runoff from upstream industry. The people living near the water knew better. They'd heard the pulse again, slow, deep, constant. Scientists returned with new technology, thermal imaging, subsonic radar, magnetic field detectors. For weeks, they recorded subtle fluctuations in the temperature of the riverbed, concentric and moving. It was as if heat itself was being drawn inward, absorbed by something large beneath the sediment. When one researcher lowered a camera, it transmitted a single frame before cutting out a vast, curved surface, glistening black, covered in ridges that looked too regular to be rock. The footage was confiscated before the public ever saw it. By 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and with it the discipline of secrecy. Fragments of once classified reports leaked through journalists and defectors. One file marked biological incident, Volga 1942. Present described recurring hydro-organic anomalies at precise coordinates near Volgograd. The data charted rhythmic sonar pulses identical to those recorded in 1943. Another declassified note read, living matter non-sapient mass indeterminate, estimated diameter exceeding 60 meters. Subject stable when undisturbed. Avoid stimulus. It was signed by Colonel A. Ilyin, the same name found in the 1943 memorandum. That revelation reignited public fascination. Documentaries speculated, tabloids screamed. Monster of the Volga, they called it, turning horror into entertainment. But beneath the laughter, quiet dread lingered. Divers still refused to enter the old sectors. Sonar technicians who scanned the depths reported feedback loops strong enough to fry equipment. One of them, interviewed years later, said, "It doesn't reflect sound, it swallows it." Then in 1994, a drought struck southern Russia. The Volga receded to its lowest level in decades, revealing stretches of riverbed unseen since the war. Mud cracked open, exposing bones, helmets, and rusted weapons. But near the center of the exposed basin, workers found something else, rows of circular depressions, perfectly symmetrical, each nearly a meter across, forming a spiral. The pattern stretched for hundreds of meters before disappearing beneath the remaining water. A geologist on site measured the alignment and realized it matched the old seismic heartbeat pattern. He quit his post the next day. Locals flocked to see it. Some treated it as a relic, a natural wonder. They took photos, joked, tossed stones into the holes. Within 48 hours, the water returned. Not from rainfall, the current reversed. It rose from beneath, swallowing the basin, drowning the holes and half the shoreline. Witnesses described the sound as a single immense inhale. One boy who stood too close vanished before anyone could move. The police searched for days. They found his shoes dry neatly side by side. After that, the government restricted all access to that section of river. Military patrols appeared at night. Floodlights burned through the fog. Official statements called it infrastructure preservation. Those who lived near the bank knew it was containment. But containment only works if the river obeys. In 2003, satellites captured a heat anomaly moving upstream opposite the current. It traveled 30 kilometers in a single week, then vanished. Hydrologists noted that the surface flow remained normal. The movement came from deep water. They speculated it was dense sediment migration. The phrase was bureaucratic code for what they truly feared: movement from below. When interviewed, one of the few surviving World War II veterans of the battle, Mikhail Yaramenko, then 91, said, "We gave it too much. Blood oil fire. We made it alive." He refused to speak further. His family claimed he woke screaming at night, gasping as if drowning. When he died, they buried him overlooking the river. The water rose the next morning and took his grave. By 2010, the myth had fused entirely with history. Urban legends spread online, night fishermen dragged downstream by invisible currents, boat engines stalling over the old coordinates, shapes rising beneath fog. Every few months, a viral clip surfaced, grainy footage of ripples forming in perfect circles, lights flickering under the surface. The comments were always the same. "It's still hungry." Environmental scientists dismissed it as hysteria, pollution, thermal convection, algal bloom. Yet privately, several admitted anomalies that no pollution could explain. One report from 2013 described sonar scans detecting a hollow cavity over 300 meters long and 70 meters deep. Inside it, something moved slowly, rhythmically. They recorded one full pulse before the scanner overloaded. It would have been easy to call it myth, if not for what happened in 2010. A tourist ferry crossing the Volga vanished mid-route between Volgograd and Krasnoslobodsk. No distress signal, no explosion. The entire vessel disappeared from radar. Rescue teams found fragments of the hull scattered across the surface edges, curved inward, as if crushed by suction. Not torn, compressed. Survivors, none. The official statement, catastrophic structural failure, due to pressure differential. But divers later whispered that the riverbed under the wreck site looked freshly disturbed, mud-churned concentric depressions forming a familiar pattern. After that, the government installed buoys, restricted crossings, and declared new safety zones. The story faded again, as all horrors do. But in the quiet villages along the Volga, they still watch the water. Some claim the fog glows faintly red before storms. Others say you can hear voices from under the surface, speaking in German-Russian. And something else older still, something that doesn't use words at all. Scientists from the Volgograd Institute continue to record data unofficially. Their logs show pressure fluctuations repeating at exact 46.2-second intervals, the same rhythm, found in 1943, 1971, 1994. The same heartbeat. Each year the amplitude grows slightly stronger. If it is alive, one physicist wrote, it is growing. And maybe that's the truth that no one wants to face, that war doesn't end. It changes form. It sinks beneath the surface and waits. The Volga doesn't rage anymore. It pulses steady, patient, vast. It doesn't need to hunt because everything eventually flows into it. The archive files now gather dust in Moscow's basements. Folders labeled hydrological irregularities. Stalingrad front sit between meteorology charts and outdated weapons manuals. But if you open them, if you read the coordinates, you'll see the pattern align perfectly with the river's deepest bend. And you'll read the final note written decades apart, but identical in meaning from 1943 and again from 2015. Avoid stimulation. Subject dormant, not neutralized. At night, when trains cross the bridges over Volgograd, passengers sometimes claim they feel a tremor, small, steady, like a pulse beneath steel. The engineers say it's nothing. The veterans never answer. And the river keeps moving slow and calm as if breathing through the dark. Because maybe Stalingrad wasn't just a battle. Maybe it was the moment the earth itself looked at what humanity had done and decided to evolve in kind. Not vengeance, not miracle, just balance. A new predator born of blood and noise. The Volga doesn't forget. It simply waits for the next war. The Volga moves as if nothing ever happened. Tourists take photographs. The water glimmers gold under evening light, and the monuments stand proud, mute guardians of a sanitized history. But when night falls and the city hum subsides, you can feel it. The silence that isn't silence. The weight beneath your feet. The air trembles not from wind, not from industry, but from something older, rhythmic, patient. Those who live along the banks say the river never truly sleeps. It exhales in long sighs when the moon is thin. It murmurs when no breeze blows. Some call it superstition, some call it madness, but the river doesn't care what it's called. It only remembers. Memory is its own kind of hunger. Every civilization built beside this river tried to name it, to own it, to channel it through stone and steel. Yet water outlasts empires. It learns their language, their violence, their prayers. It learns how to mimic stillness. And deep below, beyond the reach of light, the thing that once fed on soldiers listens, still feeling the vibration of ships, the hum of engines, the steady drumbeat of human life along its skin. A city rebuilt on top of bones. The modern world forgets quickly. Stalingrad became Volgograd. Blood became myth. Horror became lesson. School children visit the museum, trace their fingers along rusted helmets, pose for photos beside artillery shells. None of them know that just beyond the museum's windows, the water under the bridge hides an absence. Divers who have gone down for maintenance work speak of an odd phenomenon: instruments cut out exactly 46 seconds after submersion. Not 45, not 47, 46, always. They say it's interference from current fluctuation. The veterans call it the heartbeat. One of those divers, a young man named Leonid, gave an interview before he quit his job. He said he felt something like static inside his head when he went down there, a low hum that grew stronger the deeper he descended. At 60 meters, the hum turned into pressure. It felt like fingers closing around his skull, pulsing in rhythm with his own heartbeat, until they weren't the same rhythm anymore. It was inside me, he said. I surfaced before my air ran out. When I looked at my arms, they were bleeding, but I hadn't cut them. He never dove again. A year later, he drowned in his bathtub. The local archives record small disappearances along the Volga every year. Fishermen, teenagers, drunks, the occasional tourist. Each explained away by current, by carelessness, by fate. But the pattern endures. The bodies found, when they are found, share the same marks, symmetrical, circular scars, flesh collapsed, inward organs missing. Autopsy reports are sealed under confidential biological anomaly. Even now, every few years, someone writes the same note: no signs of trauma, yet no blood present. In the quiet corners of Volgograd, priests whisper their own prayers over the river. They don't speak of God. They speak of appeasement. Each spring, they throw bread and salt into the current. Not to bless it, but to distract it. When questioned by journalists, they smile and shrug old custom. But their eyes betray fatigue. They know what the soldiers knew, that the Volga is no longer water alone. It has become the sum of what it consumed. Every war leaves ghosts. Theirs linger in the archives in bones buried beneath rebuilt streets and stories told by those who survived too long. But Stalingrad's ghost is not human. It doesn't walk or whisper. It breathes. You can measure it in the pressure that builds before rain, in the way fog rolls against the current, in the sudden quiet when the wind stops. There's a rumor among scientists, unpublished, unspoken aloud, that the river's flow has changed microscopically over the last century. It slows fractionally every decade, as if thickening, as if the sediment itself resists motion. Some claim it's due to industrial pollution. Others suggest something biological. One researcher wrote anonymously, "The viscosity increases near the 1942 coordinates. Samples coagulate faster than ordinary water, like plasma." His lab was later closed for funding reasons. But the question remains, what if the river isn't just holding on to history? What if it's evolving through it? The war gave it a new language: iron, smoke, blood combustion. Now it listens to different frequencies, engines, sonar, footsteps. The Volga has always been a witness to empire. But witnesses can change. They can remember too much. When night stretches long and the city lights flicker across the water, some people claim they see faces below the surface. Not reflections, faces looking up, faint outlines formed by shifting silt. Some swear the faces move, changing shape, lips opening soundlessly. Others hear whispers, not words, just breath through water. The authorities dismiss it as pareidolia, pattern-seeking and chaos. But no one lingers long enough to argue. Every generation tells itself that it has outgrown superstition. But superstition is only the echo of experience too strange to explain. The archives are full of those echoes. The diary of a nurse in 1943 who wrote, "When the men stop screaming, the river starts." A post-war hydrologist who measured unidentified vibrations beneath the surface consistent with biological respiration. A radio operator who recorded static that pulsed at 46-second intervals for 17 minutes before his transmission cut. Fact, myth, and fear, all describing the same pattern. The question is not whether it exists. The question is what it has become after 80 years of silence. Because hunger doesn't end with starvation. It learns patience. The river has fed on iron, on human blood, on sound itself. What does it feed on now? Energy, thought, memory. Some say that when the city is quietest between 3 and 4 in the morning, you can hear it calling. A slow, low hum, as if the earth beneath is dreaming. The fog moves in perfect rhythm with it, expanding and contracting. Birds don't fly then. Dogs refuse to bark. And those who listen too long say the sound enters their chest and syncs with their heartbeat. 1 or 2 have gone missing after describing it. Scientists still visit discreetly, often from abroad. They call it the Stalingrad anomaly. They study the magnetic fields, the currents, the sonar pulses. None have found answers. The data always collapses into noise, the frequencies swallowed by interference that shouldn't exist. It's as if the signal eats itself, one physicist said. Another replied, no, it's as if something's listening and doesn't want us to hear. War memorials line the banks, now polished and permanent. The tourists read plaques, leave flowers, and move on. But if you stand at the edge and close your eyes, you can feel it, the same pulse that haunted soldiers in 1942, the same rhythm buried beneath their fear. History books call it a siege. Nature might call it digestion. The Volga runs to the Caspian Sea, but it never releases everything it carries. Somewhere along that journey, it holds back what matters most, the memory of sound, of death, of the first time the water tasted flesh. In laboratories, they speak of the river's self-cleaning mechanism. They mean biology, chemistry, ecology. But the truth may be simpler. It cleans itself by consuming. And maybe that's what Stalingrad has always meant. Not victory, not tragedy, but transformation. The battle that fed something new into the veins of the earth. A reminder that nature watches, absorbs, and adapts. Humanity builds its cities on rivers, trusting water to carry away its sins. But rivers don't forget. They remember everything we pour into them, blood, oil, lies. And sometimes they return it. Tonight, the Volga glides under the bridges, smooth and silent. The city sleeps, unaware of the pulse beneath. The lights ripple across the current like veins of gold over black flesh. And down below, in the cold dark, the heartbeat continues, slow, steady, endless. Maybe it's not a monster. Maybe it's simply the consequence of war, a creation of balance. We opened the earth, filled it with steel and screams, and the earth responded. The soldiers thought they were fighting each other, but they were feeding something else. What if Stalingrad wasn't just a wound in human history, but the first breath of something larger, something that learned to live from death itself? The river doesn't speak in words. It speaks in rhythm. It speaks through time. And even now, as the world forgets, it waits for another storm, another feast. Because the Volga does not forgive. It absorbs. It endures. It listens. And when the next war comes, when metal and blood and fire return, it will remember the taste. And somewhere beneath the calm reflection of a rebuilt city, it will open its mouth again. And somewhere beneath the calm reflection of the rebuilt city, it will open its mouth again. The river never stops. It only waits. Waits for the next tremor, the next drop of blood, the next vibration strong enough to remind it what it once was. Every empire that touches the Volga leaves behind a taste. Every century it feeds differently on iron, on faith, on memory. And still, through all the layers of silence and time, the same pulse rises from below 46 seconds apart, as steady as a heartbeat, as ancient as the first scream swallowed by water. What if Stalingrad wasn't an ending, but a beginning? What if humanity, in trying to master war, created its first god of hunger? The monuments will tell you the story ended with victory. The river disagrees. It still carries the bones, the breath, the echo. It still hums the song of that winter, the sound of men drowning in a place where ice should have kept them safe. The Volga hums, and the world pretends not to hear. When you stand there at dusk, listen carefully. The traffic fades. The bells stop ringing. For a moment, everything aligns. The city breathes with the river. The air thickens. You feel a pressure in your chest. That's when you'll understand it was never just a story. It's a memory repeating itself, waiting for you to believe. And when you finally turn away, when the water behind you ripples for no reason, don't look back. The Volga doesn't like to be watched. It prefers to be remembered. What if they hadn't underestimated it? What if every war leaves behind not ghosts, but new life? The answer moves beneath the surface, unseen, eternal. You've just listened to another file from Shadow Stories. If you want to uncover more buried truths, subscribe and stay with us for the next case, where the echoes of history still breathe just beneath the ice.